The rain tapped lightly against the towering glass windows of Hayes Manor, a soft rhythm almost drowned out by the crackling fireplace. Inside the grand study, Victor Hayes leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of aged scotch as he stared at the chessboard before him. His opponent, a smug venture capitalist, had just resigned after falling for Victor's favorite trap. Victor smirked. Another easy win. Another evening wasted on mediocrity. "You're ruthless, Victor," the man said with an awkward laugh, gathering his coat. "No, I'm precise," Victor corrected coldly. "Ruthlessness implies chaos. Chess is about order." When the door shut behind his guest, Victor let out a long sigh. For all his wealth, for all the power he wielded in boardrooms, he couldn't escape this gnawing boredom. No one challenged him anymore. That's when the sound of soft giggling caught his attention. He turned his head slightly and spotted Grace, his housekeeper, standing in the hallway with a mop. At her side was a small girl, no more than 10, clutching a worn backpack and a threadbare teddy bear. "I'm sorry, sir," Grace stammered. "The school closed early today because of the storm, so I had to bring a mirror with me." Victor waved his hand dismissively. "Children aren't forbidden here, Grace. Just keep her out of the study." Amira peeked around her mother's legs, her wide brown eyes scanning the massive room, the towering bookshelves, the marble floor, and finally the chessboard. "You know how to play?" Victor asked, his voice almost amused. Amira nodded shyly. "A little. My grandpa taught me." Victor raised an eyebrow. He tapped the chair opposite him. "Come here." Grace's eyes widened. "Sir, she's just a child. She won't break to pieces, I assume," Victor said dryly. "Besides, I could use a distraction." Amira hesitated, then stepped forward, her shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. She sat across from Victor, her tiny hands resting on her lap. "White or black?" he asked. "White," she said softly. "Ah!" The first move. Bold. Victor smirked as he reset the board. This will be over in 5 minutes, he thought. Amira studied the pieces intently before moving her pawn to e4. Victor replied with e5, almost lazily, but then Amira played an f3, her fingers delicate yet confident. Victor paused just for a second, a classic opening. "Lucky guess?" he countered. Amira's eyes never left the board. She shifted in her seat and moved her bishop to c4. Victor's smirk faltered. "The Italian game?" Grace peeked nervously from the hallway, wringing her hands. "Your grandfather taught you this?" Victor asked, his tone sharper now. "Yes," Amira said. He said chess is like life. If you make good moves early, you'll do fine later. Victor leaned forward, intrigued. For the first time in years, his pulse quickened. 10 moves in, he realized he wasn't playing against a child. He was playing against a mind that saw through his strategies, calmly, methodically, and with quiet brilliance. When Amira sacrificed her bishop to pin his queen, Victor's jaw tightened. That wasn't luck. That was vision. "Grace," Victor called without looking up. "Yes, sir," she asked nervously. "Your daughter, she's exceptional." Grace blinked, unsure whether to feel pride or fear. Victor glanced back at Amira, who sat there patiently, swinging her legs slightly. "You win in 3 moves if I do nothing," he said finally. Amira tilted her head. "Should I show you?" Victor let out a laugh, sharp, almost disbelieving. "Please do." And just like that, Amira cornered his king. Checkmate. The room fell silent, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. Victor leaned back, staring at the little girl in awe. "Well, you've made my evening interesting, Miss Amira." "Thank you," she said softly. Victor's expression hardened, but his voice was thoughtful. "Grace, I want to play her again. Tomorrow." Grace stiffened. "Sir, I don't think." "She has something rare," Victor interrupted. "A mind like hers doesn't come around often. It would be a waste not to see how far it can go." Amira hugged her teddy bear tight, unsure whether to feel excited or scared. Victor stood, towering over them both, but for the first time in years, his eyes weren't cold. They were alive. "Tomorrow," he said again. "Same time." And with that, The billionaire walked out of the study, already forming a plan that would change all their lives. Victor invites Amira back, but his motivations are unclear. Is he intrigued, or is this another of his power games? Kindly subscribe to this channel for more story. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Hayes Manor, but the warmth never seemed to penetrate the cold, polished marble floors. Grace stood nervously in the foyer, adjusting the straps of Amira's faded backpack. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her daughter's hair. "Amira, remember," Grace whispered. "Be respectful. Don't make him angry. And if he says something cruel, just—" "Mama," Amira interrupted gently. "I'll be okay." Grace sighed. She didn't like this. Not one bit. But after last night's game, Victor Hayes had insisted on seeing Amira again, and what the billionaire wanted, he always got. A deep voice startled them both. "You're late." Victor descended the grand staircase, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit with his tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd been working for hours already. He stopped in front of them, his piercing eyes fixed on Amira. "She's a child, sir," Grace said softly. "It won't happen again." "I'm not blaming her," Victor replied, his tone clipped. "Time management is a skill, one she'll need if she's going to compete." "Compete?" Grace echoed. Victor ignored her and turned to Amira. "Follow me." Amira looked back at her mother, who gave her a worried nod, then scurried after the billionaire into the cavernous study. The chessboard was already set, but this time, the room felt different. Two high-backed chairs faced each other across the polished mahogany table, and a large notebook lay open beside Victor's seat. "Sit," he instructed. Amira climbed into the chair, her small hands resting on her lap. "Do you know why you won yesterday?" Victor asked. "Because you didn't see my moves coming?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "True, but you won because you understand patterns. Most children your age play chess like a guessing game. You don't." "Grandpa said the board tells a story if you listen," Amira said softly. Victor tilted his head. "The board tells a story." He repeated it under his breath, intrigued. "Today we start with openings," he said firmly. "You'll learn the Sicilian defense, the Queen's Gambit, and how to dismantle them." Amira nodded eagerly. The first hour went smoothly. Victor demonstrated famous openings, and Amira absorbed each one like a sponge, her eyes flicking between the board and his hand as he moved the pieces with precision. But by the second hour, Victor's tone shifted. "No, that's wrong. Again." Amira frowned. "But if I do that, you'll take my knight." "Better I take your knight than your queen," Victor snapped. "Sacrifice is essential. Learn it now or you'll crumble later." Amira bit her lip. "Grandpa didn't make me play like this. He let me figure out on my own." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Your grandfather wasn't training a champion. I am." Amira's tiny fists clenched. "I don't want to be a champion. I just like playing." Victor froze for a moment. Just like playing? He remembered being 10 years old himself, locked in a room by his father until he'd memorized 100 chess positions. The memory soured his mood. "Liking something isn't enough," he said coldly. "The world doesn't reward liking. It rewards winning." Amira looked down, her shoulders slumping. Victor sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. He hadn't meant to sound so harsh, not to her. Grace appeared in the doorway with a tray of tea, watching the two silently. "She's only 10, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "She doesn't need to win. She needs to breathe." Victor shot her a look, but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back his chair and studied Amira. "You're stubborn," he said finally. "Good. Stubbornness is the beginning of resilience." Amira looked up, her eyes glistening but defiant. Victor leaned forward. "One more game. If you win, we'll take a break. If you lose," he smirked, "you'll run 10 laps around the garden." Amira's jaw dropped. "That's not fair." "Life isn't fair," Victor replied flatly. But to his surprise, Amira grinned. "Fine, but if I win, you have to run 10 laps." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Agreed." The game began, and from the first move, Victor realized something had changed. Amira's eyes burned with determination. She wasn't just playing anymore. She was strategizing, adapting, learning. Move after move, Victor tested her defenses, trying to push her into a mistake, but she held steady. "Not bad," Victor muttered. Amira smirked. "I'm not done yet." 10 minutes later, Victor stared at the board in disbelief. His king was trapped. "Checkmate. 10 laps," Amira said sweetly. Victor barked out a laugh, startling Grace in the doorway. "You're a little tyrant," he said, standing, "but I keep my word." And so, for the first time in his life, Victor Hayes, billionaire, chess master, and feared businessman, jogged 10 laps around his own garden, while a 10-year-old girl and her mother watched from the steps, both giggling uncontrollably. By the time he returned, out of breath but strangely exhilarated, Victor felt something unfamiliar, a warmth in his chest. "Same time tomorrow," he said to Amira, trying to sound stern but failing to hide his smile. "Yes, Mr. Hayes," she replied, her grin wide. As Victor watches Amira skip out of the study, he realizes for the first time in years he's looking forward to tomorrow. But in the shadows, his jealous nephew watches him from a window, already plotting how to use the girl to bring Victor down. The sound of porcelain shattering echoed through the Hayes mansion dining hall. Victor's younger brother, Edward Hayes, stood with his hands on the long mahogany table, his face red with fury. "Have you lost your mind, Victor?" Edward bellowed. "You're training the Maid's daughter like she's your protege? Don't you see how this makes us look?" Victor sat calmly at the head of the table, swirling a glass of red wine, as though his brother's tantrum were background noise. "It makes me look like a man with an eye for talent," Victor replied smoothly. "It makes you look weak," Edward spat. "You've built an empire by crushing competition and showing no vulnerability. And now, you're letting a child humiliate you in chess and parade around like she belongs here." Victor's lips curled into a cold smirk. "She does belong here. In fact, she's the only one in this house with enough intelligence to challenge me." Edward slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't about chess, Victor. This is about perception. Investors are asking questions. The board is restless. They think you're distracted, slipping even." Victor set his glass down with a sharp clink. His voice dropped to a deadly calm. "Tell the board they work for me, not the other way around. And as for perception, perhaps they should be more worried about a grown man so threatened by a 10-year-old girl that he runs to me, crying like a schoolboy." Edward's face twisted with rage, but he didn't reply. He stormed out of the room, the echo of his shoes fading down the hall. Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For a moment, his gaze softened as he thought of Amira. "Don't worry, little genius," he murmured. "They won't touch you. Not while I'm alive." Amira stared at the rows of chessboards before her, her small fingers gripping the straps of her faded backpack. The Harbor City Junior Chess Open wasn't some quiet game in a mansion study. It was loud, crowded, and filled with kids twice her size slamming pieces down like warriors on a battlefield. "Are you nervous?" Victor asked, crouching beside her. Amira looked up at him, her big brown eyes wide but determined. "A little." Victor straightened his tie. "Good. Fear sharpens the mind. Just don't let it control you." Grace pulled Amira into a hug, whispering, "You don't have to prove anything, baby. Just have fun." Amira nodded, though deep down she knew this wasn't just a game anymore, not with Victor watching. Her first opponent was a boy named Caleb, the reigning local champion. He wore a smug grin as he tapped his clock and moved his pawn. "You're going down, newbie," he sneered. Amira didn't reply. She just studied the board. Move after move, she built her position carefully, remembering Victor's lessons. Control the center. Anticipate threats. Sacrifice when necessary. But halfway through the game, Caleb launched an aggressive attack that cornered her king. The crowd murmured as Amira's fingers hovered over the board, her heart pounding. "Think, Amira, think." In the back of the room, Victor watched silently. He could see it, the fear creeping in. One wrong move and she was finished. "Don't rush," he whispered under his breath. Amira closed her eyes for a second and remembered her grandfather's words. "The board tells a story. Listen to it." She opened her eyes and saw it. the trap Caleb had laid for her, but he'd left one square unguarded. Amira shifted her knight. Caleb's grin faded. 5 moves later, Amira whispered, "Checkmate." The crowd gasped. Caleb slammed his fist on the table and stormed off. Victor allowed himself the faintest smile, but not everyone was impressed. Later that evening, Victor's phone buzzed. It was a text from Edward. Check the headlines. Your little prodigy's making waves. Victor opened the news app. Billionaire Victor Hayes raises eyebrows by sponsoring Maid's daughter in chess tournament. Social experiment or publicity stunt. Investors concerned over Hayes' unusual obsession with prodigy child. Victor's jaw tightened. He knew this was Edward's doing, leaking the story to make him look unstable. When Victor returned to the mansion, he found Grace pacing the foyer, holding Amira close. "Sir, people are calling me, journalists, strangers, even some horrible ones saying awful things about my baby." Grace's voice trembled. "We can't do this. I don't want her in the spotlight." Amira looked up at Victor, her lip quivering. "Did I do something wrong?" Victor knelt before her. "You were brilliant. None of this is your fault." He stood and turned to Grace. "This isn't a choice anymore. They've made her a target, and the only way to protect her is to make her untouchable." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "She's just a little girl." Victor's expression softened. "She won't stay little forever. And I promise you, no one will harm her while I'm standing." The next day, Victor called in a favor with an old friend, a world-renowned chess coach named Elena Markov. "She's talented," Victor explained over the phone, "but raw. I need her polished before the Nationals." "You're serious about this?" Elena asked. "For once in my life, yes," Victor replied. As he hung up, Victor caught sight of Amira in the garden, practicing on a small portable chess set. Her face was set with determination, her little fingers moving pieces with surprising precision. But in the shadows beyond the hedges, Edward watched silently, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Let's see how long your little pawn survives, brother," he murmured. Victor begins preparing Amira for Nationals with the help of Elena, but Edward secretly hires someone to sabotage Amira's rise and Victor's reputation. The steady tick of the clock echoed in the grand study as Victor Hayes stood by the window, watching rain streak down the glass like tears. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, but he didn't turn. He already knew what the call was about. Amira had lost. For the first time since she'd stepped into his life, she'd fallen hard. The Harbor City Nationals had been packed with energy and noise. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and the murmurs of the billionaire's maid's daughter rippled through the crowd like poison. Amira had sat at her table, her little fingers trembling over the board. Across from her, a tall, smirking boy named Julian Kane, the son of a tech mogul, twirled a bishop between his fingers like a toy. "You don't belong here," Julian whispered. "My dad says you're just a charity case for Hayes." Amira swallowed hard but stayed quiet. Victor had taught her not to engage. Silence is your weapon. Let the board speak for you. But Julian's opening was fast and aggressive. Too aggressive. He's leaving holes everywhere, Amira thought. He's reckless. Victor watched from the sidelines, his jaw tight. "Calm down, little genius. Don't rush." But Amira wasn't calm. Her palms were sweaty. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. "She's out of her depth. Hayes is using her to clean his image. Poor child, she's just a pawn." She made her first mistake on move 15, losing a knight in a desperate attempt to attack. Then another mistake, trading her queen too early, and then it all crumbled. "Checkmate," Julian said smugly, slamming his clock. The crowd erupted. Some applauded. Others laughed. Amira stared at the board, her throat tight. She didn't even feel the tears until they hit her hands. Victor stood frozen, his hands curling into fists. He wanted to grab her, shield her, tell the crowd to shut up, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Grace rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Amira, whispering, "It's okay, baby, it's okay." Victor stayed rooted in place as Amira was let out of the hall, her sobs muffled against her mother's coat. The next morning, Victor's phone finally buzzed the call he'd been waiting for. It's confirmed, Elena Markov said grimly on the other end. That boy, Julian Kane, was fed your training strategies. Someone leaked them to his coach. Victor's hand tightened around the phone. Edward, your brother? Who else? Victor's voice was ice. He's been trying to undermine me for months. He doesn't care about chess. He cares about destroying me. What now? Elena asked. Victor looked out at the gray sky. Now I'll fix this. For her. Amira hadn't left her room in 2 days. She sat on her bed clutching her old teddy bear, her eyes red and swollen. I'm not a genius, she whispered to her mother. I'm a joke. Grace brushed her daughter's hair gently. You're not a joke, baby. You're a fighter. One loss doesn't erase what you've done. Amira shook her head. Everyone thinks I don't belong. Maybe they're right. Downstairs, Victor paced the study like a caged animal. For years, he believed emotions were weaknesses, tools to be exploited. But now, with Amira crumbling upstairs, he felt something unfamiliar gnawing at his chest. He cared, and he didn't know what to do with that. That evening, Victor climbed the stairs and knocked gently on Amira's door. Go away, she mumbled. I will, Victor said softly. But first, let me tell you something. There was silence, then a faint whine. Victor stepped in, looking strangely out of place in her small, cozy room. He sat awkwardly on the edge of her bed. When I was your age, she began, my father locked me in a room for 12 hours because I lost a chess match. He told me losers had no place in the Hayes family. Amira's tear-streaked face turned toward him, her eyes wide. I swore that day I'd never lose again. And I didn't, but I also stopped playing for fun. It became a war. And do you know what I realized? Amira shook her head. I wasn't happy. Not once. Until I met you. Me, she whispered. Yes. You remind me what chess should feel like. Not a weapon. Not a curse. A dance. Amira let out a small laugh. A dance. Victor smiled faintly. Don't tell anyone I said that. The next morning, Victor surprised Amira by setting up the chessboard. Not in the cold study, but outside in the garden. Why out here? She asked. Because the sun is shining, and we're not training today. We're playing. Just playing. Just playing. At first, Amira hesitated, but as the game unfolded, she began to laugh and joke, her shoulders loosening. And for the first time in years, Victor laughed too. When Amira finally beat him with a creative, unexpected move, Victor clapped his hands. Brilliant. That's the spark I've been waiting for. Amira grinned, her eyes shining with new confidence. Later that evening, Victor met with Elena in the study. Edward played dirty, Victor said, so we'll hit back harder. Elena raised an eyebrow. How? Amira doesn't just need to beat the kids her age. She needs to crush them, and then take on adults. Grandmasters, if we have to. I want the world to see she's no pawn. Elena smirked. So you're all in now? Victor's eyes hardened. It was the moment she looked at me in the rain and said, help me, as Victor and Amira prepare for the next tournament. Edward escalates his schemes, this time targeting Grace in a way that could tear the little family apart. The sound of laughter filled the Hayes mansion for the first time in years. Amira and Victor sat hunched over the chessboard in the sunroom, their faces illuminated by the warm afternoon glow. Check, Amira announced proudly, moving her queen with a flourish. Victor arched an eyebrow, bold but reckless. Amira's smile faltered as Victor shifted his rook, trapping her queen. Checkmate, he said softly. Amira groaned and flopped back in her chair. I was so close. Victor chuckled, a real, genuine sound that surprised even him. Close is dangerous in chess. But you're improving faster than I expected. As Amira reset the board, Grace appeared at the door with a worried expression. Mr. Hayes, she said quietly, can I speak with you? Victor caught the tension in her voice immediately. He stood. Amira, take a short break. Go practice puzzles in the library. Amira grabbed her notebook and scampered off, humming softly to herself. Victor turned to Grace, his smile fading. What happened? Edward's attack. Grace held out her phone. On the screen was an email with the subject line, "Your employment status at Hayes Industries." Victor scanned the message quickly. His jaw tightened. "They're terminating me?" Grace whispered, "Effective immediately. And there's a clause saying my work performance is under investigation. They've frozen my account too." Victor's hands curled into fists. He didn't need to guess who was behind this. "Edward," he growled. "He's attacking you because he knows I won't stand by." Grace's voice trembled. "I can't lose this job, Mr. Hayes. I don't care about me. But, Amira," Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, surprising even himself. "No one is taking your job, and no one is touching your daughter. As long as you're under my roof, your family." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Why are you doing this for us?" Victor hesitated. "Because for the first time in my life, I care about someone more than winning." That evening, Victor stormed into Edward's penthouse office without knocking. "You went too far," Victor said coldly. Edward looked up from his drink, unfazed. "Ah, the great Victor Hayes, knight in shining armor for the Maid and her little prodigy." Victor's eyes darkened. Reverse determination. "Now!" Edward smirked. "Or what? You'll cut me out of the company? The board won't allow it." Victor leaned in, his voice like ice. "Try me. I built this empire. You're just a spoiled brat who inherited my shadow." Edward's smirk faltered. "She's just a kid, Victor. Why are you risking everything for her?" Victor straightened. "Because she's more than a kid. She's extraordinary. Something you'll never be." Days later, Amira stood in the crowded auditorium of the Harbor City Invitational, her tiny hands gripping the edges of the chessboard. This wasn't a junior match anymore. Victor had entered her in the open division, where adults and title players competed. Across from her sat Elena Petrova, a 17-year-old international master from Russia. Her long braid swung as she leaned back in her chair, sizing up Amira with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You're the billionaire's pet project, yes?" Elena said in a thick accent, "Let's see how long you last." Amira swallowed hard, but she remembered Victor's words. "She's stronger than you, faster, but you see the board in ways no one else does. Trust your instincts." The clock started. Victor and Grace sat together in the audience. Grace clutched his arm tightly. "She's so small compared to her," Grace whispered. Victor didn't take his eyes off the board. So was David against Goliath. Amira opened with the Queen's Gambit. Elena countered confidently, setting traps with every move. But Amira wasn't rattled. She played with calm precision, weaving her pieces into a tight net of control. The match stretched past 90 minutes, and the room fell silent as players gathered around their table. Elena frowned for the first time as Amira's rook sliced through her defenses. "Check," Amira said softly. 5 moves later, it was over. "Checkmate." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Victor felt his throat tighten as he stood and clapped slowly. Amira looked up and saw him smiling. Not his usual cold, calculated smile, but one of pure pride. That night, back at the mansion, Victor surprised Amira and Grace with a small celebration in the dining hall. A cake stood in the center of the table with the words, "To our champion." Amira gasped, "You got me a cake?" Victor smiled faintly. "Well, technically I instructed the chef to get it, but yes." Grace touched his arm. "Thank you for everything." Victor looked at her, his voice low. "You don't have to thank me. You and Amira, you've given me more than I've ever given you." As they sat down to eat, for the first time in years, Victor didn't feel like a billionaire or a chess master. He felt like family as Victor and Amira celebrate their victory. Edward makes a secret deal with a rival chess federation to block Amira from competing internationally, unless Victor sacrifices his entire company to protect her future. The Hayes mansion was quiet. Too quiet. Victor stood in his study, staring at a chessboard mid-game. But for the first time, his mind wasn't on the pieces. His phone vibrated on the desk, the screen flashing Edward's name. He didn't answer. He already knew what the call was about. Edward had done it. By bribing officials at the World Chess Federation, Edward had successfully blocked Amira from competing in the International Youth Championship. The message was clear. If Victor wanted Amira's dreams restored, he'd have to give up Hayes Industries, the company he'd spent his life building. Victor picked up the Black King and gripped it tightly until his knuckles turned white. "Everything I built," he murmured. "Do I let it burn for her?" Across town, Grace sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her phone. Headlines screamed at her. Amira Carter disqualified amidst eligibility scandal. Billionaire's prodigy banned from international stage. Amira stood by the window, staring out at the garden. She wasn't crying. She'd done enough of that last night. "Mama," she whispered, "maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong with those kids. Maybe I should quit." Grace wrapped her arms around her daughter. "Don't you dare say that. You belong anywhere you want to be. And Mr. Hayes, he'll fix this. I know he will." But even as she spoke, Grace wasn't sure she believed her own words. Later that night, Victor met Edward in the boardroom of Hayes Industries. "You win," Victor said flatly, tossing a thick folder onto the table. Edward opened it, his eyes gleaming as he saw the signed documents. "So you're stepping down, handing me the company?" Victor's jaw tightened. "On one condition. Amira's eligibility is reinstated immediately, and I want a public statement clearing her name." Edward leaned back, smug. "You're throwing away decades of work for a child who isn't even yours?" Victor's eyes burned like steel. "She is mine. She's more mine than this soulless empire ever was." Edward chuckled. "You've gone soft, brother." Victor stood. "No, Edward. I've finally found something worth fighting for." 2 weeks later, Amira stepped into the Grand Hall of the International Youth Championship in Paris. The air buzzed with excitement as cameras flashed and reporters whispered her name. Amira Carter, the comeback story of the year. Victor walked beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Grace followed close behind, her eyes misty with pride. "Are you nervous?" Victor asked. Amira shook her head. "I'm ready." Victor knelt to meet her gaze. "Win or lose, you've already made me proud." Amira smiled. "I'm not losing." Amira's opponent was a boy from China, a prodigy known as a dragon of the East. He'd been undefeated for 3 years. The crowd held its breath as the game began. Amira opened with her signature Queen's Gambit, her fingers steady as stone. The dragon countered fiercely, launching complex attacks designed to overwhelm her. But Amira was calm. Every lesson Victor had taught her, every painful loss she'd endured. It all led to this moment. Piece by piece, she dismantled his defenses. Victor watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding harder than in any boardroom negotiation. Grace gripped his hand tightly. "She's incredible," she whispered. "She's unstoppable," Victor murmured. On the 60-second move, Amira leaned forward and whispered, "Checkmate." The auditorium erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. Victor didn't hear them. His eyes were locked on Amira as she rose from her chair and raised her arms in triumph. She'd done it. After the ceremony, Victor found Amira sitting alone in the garden outside the hall, clutching her golden trophy. "You were brilliant," he said softly. Amira looked up. "I couldn't have done it without you." Victor knelt before her. "Amira, I've lost a lot in my life. Friends, family, even my company. But I don't regret a thing, because I found you." Amira's eyes filled with tears. "Are you saying?" Victor smiled faintly. "I'm saying I'd be honored to be your father, if you'll have me." Amira threw her arms around him, sobbing. "You already are." Months later, Hayes Manor was no longer a cold, lonely palace. Victor had transformed it into the Amira Hayes Chess Academy, a sanctuary for gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. Amira became its first student and, soon after, its first teacher. In the study, Victor watched proudly as Amira guided a group of kids through basic chess openings, her laughter filling the room. Grace entered with tea and smiled at the sight. "You gave up everything for her," she said, "and yet you look happier than ever." Victor looked at her, his eyes soft. "That's because, for the first time in my life, I am." Outside, Amira set up a chessboard in the garden for her next lesson. "Your move, Mr. Hayes," she called playfully. Victor smiled as he walked outside to join her, the sun setting behind them in a golden glow. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on the chessboard, but in the heart. Kindly like and subscribe to this channel for more stories.